Up until now in the How to Quilt video series, each of our quilt blocks has dealt with right angles, squares and rectangles, straight lines. But a lot of quilts get more interesting when we add in diagonal lines, which we can get by making triangles. So that's what we're going to start working on, half square triangles in this episode of How to Quilt. Pinwheel block is a quilting classic, and it's made up of an element called a half square triangle. Half square triangles are exactly what they sound like. They are squares that are half one color or fabric and half another color or fabric. The difference between that and just two rectangles put together to make a square is that the change happens along the diagonal line so that it looks like two triangles stitched together at the base to make a square. Half square triangles, which are often abbreviated HST, half square triangle, are a core element of good quilts because they make it possible to create these really interesting shapes that you can't get from squares and rectangles. And one of those is the pinwheel. The pinwheel block, a real classic, is made of half square triangles that are arranged so that one fabric's points go around the circle like a child's pinwheel spinning in the breeze. We're going to make a pinwheel block, but use that as a unit in a larger block so that you can start to see that when you take a particular design, a particular quilt block design, and repeat it over and over, you can play with how those repeats interact. For example, if I make a pinwheel block where 4 of the triangles are pink, and 4 of the triangles are green, and I combine that with 3 other pinwheel blocks, I can alternate where the different colors fall in order to get a new design. There are lots of techniques for making half square triangles. This first one is a 4 at a time half square triangle technique. It's one of the simplest you'll ever do, and I have deliberately given measurements for the fabric so that you will have room to trim your half square triangles down. Lots of experienced quilters will tell you that it makes for much easier quilting when your half square triangles are slightly bigger than you need, and then you can trim them down. And we're going to look at how we can use our clear acrylic ruler to make that job even easier. So let's start with our 4 at a time half square triangle technique. Then we will press and trim, and then we'll assemble our pinwheel blocks. We're starting with our 4 fabrics, and I've got this delicious wasabi color, and then a beautiful medium gray, and this berry that I can't get away from, this plum color that I love so much, and then twice as many of this school busy goldenrod color, right? So 4, 4, 4, and 8 of each. All of these measure 5.5 inches square when they were cut. We're going to assemble our half square triangles using the diagram in our pattern that shows that each of these fabrics gets placed against one of these. So we're making pairs. So I'm going to take one school bus and one plum, and I'm going to place them right sides together, raw edges even. And then I'm going to repeat and do the same thing with one of the gray and with one of this wasabi color, right sides together, raw edges even. It really doesn't make a big difference which fabric is on the top and which is on the bottom. Just need to make sure that my edges are even all the way around and that it's right sides together before I take these to the sewing machine. Here at the machine, I'm going to sew one after another using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going all the way around the entire perimeter of each square. When I get to this edge, I want to stop a 1/4 inch away from that far edge so that I can pivot in my fabric. Now, my presser foot is made with these little notches in it that indicate distance from the needle. So this notch is even with the needle. This notch is a 1/4 inch behind it, and this notch is a 1/4 inch in front of it,
which means when this notch gets to the raw edge of my fabric, I'm going to stop with my needle down. There, see it's all lined up. Lift my presser foot, but leave my needle in the fabric. Pivot, see, pivot, lower my presser foot again. And you can see, once I've pivoted, see how the raw edge is right at that 1/4 inch seam allowance? So that I can keep going. At the very end, when I come back to where I started, I just stitch back over it, and then I'm done. Lather, rinse, repeat until all your pairs of squares have been stitched all the way around all 4 sides. So we come back from the machine, and these are all stitched and ready to go. I've trimmed off my threads because that's just good habits. And now we're prepared to cut these apart into triangles. We're going to do that by cutting an X through the center, which is going to make 1, 2, 3, 4 half square triangles. But I want you to consider that if my grain for my fabric is going this way, then anything cut on the diagonal by definition is on the bias of the fabric, so it's going to have some stretch. That means that the outer edges of these triangles are going to be unstable. One of the ways to prevent that is to press with stabilizing spray ahead of time, which I've done. But also keep in mind that this diagonal line, once we cut it, is gonna wanna stretch out of shape. So we wanna handle it delicately. All right, so once across, and then we still have a seam. And then once again, and you can use, there are lines in your ruler to make a lot of tasks like this easier. So for example, here's my 45-degree angle. And if I line that up here, this is straight up and down. And I can have a really nice line there. Or if you want to get crazy, you can kind of eyeball it a little bit with just a straight edge here and not worry so much about where the 45 is, but you do want to cut through that pivot point. So now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, all just alike and ready to go to the iron. And I'm going to press these up. And this is a pretty simple process. We always press toward the dark side, one of those fun things quilters love to say, but also it prevents ghosting. So this seam, if this is my darker fabric, if I press toward the lighter fabric, it's going to show through on the finished product. So by always pressing our seams toward the darker fabric, we get a more beautiful finished result. And it also allows us to combine our fabrics down the road in ways that create optical illusions that can be really fun to look at. All right, so here this is pressed. I've worked hard to make this line good and straight, but can you see that as a result, these edges are they're neither straight nor square, and that's all right. I've made this slightly oversized so that I can trim it down to the size required by my pattern without having to worry about being too precious.
I think, so I hear from a lot of quilters, particularly very experienced quilters, that, they hate trimming. And some of that, if you think back to the log cabin block, which is part of the How to Quilt video series. Some of the trimming that we do, you're just trimming threads, just tiny little bits off these blocks. But you get such exact results. And as you've seen, putting together rail fence and 9-patch and the lattice block, those tiny little differences in measurement can result in inaccurate seams lining up, in less than satisfactory results. By making our half square triangles just a tiny bit oversized, which means it's possible for us to trim it down, even if it's just a few threads, we get such accuracy in our piecing that it can make the results a lot more pleasing. But I would like to take a moment to caution you against perfectionism. Some of the joy of quilting is in the process rather than the product. And if the process, the actual activity of creating the unit, doing the piecing, doing the trimming, assembling the block, if that process becomes too focused on perfection, some of the fun gets sucked out of it. We think as we are working that the more perfect our sewing is, the happier we will be with the end result. And that isn't always the case. A lot of times in your finished quilt, because as you're working, as you're at the sewing machine, you are literally 6 inches away from everything you're doing all the time. But in the finished quilt, you aren't. You are 6 inches away from the person snuggled under the quilt with you. Or you are 6 inches away from your grandchild's face as they open the package. Or, you are 6 inches away from the thermometer because you're, fighting off a cold. You're not thinking about how flawlessly accurate your seams were. You're thinking about the joy and pleasure you get from the life you live under that quilt. That's the heart of quilting. So I love knowing that there are techniques that I can share and that I can practice that will help me have a more accurate result, but I absolutely would be cheating you if I didn't also communicate that perfection is not our goal. If we fall prey to this idea of having a perfect product, we can poison the process, and the process can be so rewarding by itself, so therapeutic, so meditative. I want you to have that. I want that for you. So I'm going to walk you through trimming, and I'm going to talk to you about how to get the best results you can get. But I'm also going to constantly encourage you to give yourself compassion and grace, to recognize that the doing is where the love is, and that includes love for the person who gets your quilt, but also love for yourself. We're here because this is our happy place and we're having a good time.
So we started here. We had our individual squares. We stitched them all the way around all 4 sides, pivoting at the corners. And now we've cut it apart along the diagonal to make 4 half square triangles. Pressed my seam allowances toward the darker fabric, but now I need to trim them down. And our instructions indicate that we're trimming these to 3.5 inches square. When I get my ruler here, can you see that it is barely over 3.5 inches square? So I'm going to trim it down and make it the measurement I need. I have this wonderful diagonal line here, which is in the ruler, and hopefully will lie right on top of that seam that I've pressed. So I'm going to scooch my ruler over so that the 3.5 inch edge is to the inside, but there's still enough on the other side to trim. Stabilize it, take off my safety, stabilize again, trim again, just a tiny bit. This is a little imperfect. The goal is to get that seam right at the point. All right, see, this is imperfect. That's all right. I'm going to let this go and figure it's going to work itself out. But I am going to do my best on this other one because I want you guys to see how it should work, because we got a bunch more of these to do. We're making a total here of 16. All right, there we go. Let's do another. I'm going to use my best technique here. Boop. All right, that's prettier. There's my 3.5. This one has even less to trim. See, this one's almost 3.5 all by itself. I'm going to get in there and I'm going to trim off that little dog ear at the corner. That's what this guy's called. He's a dog ear. And some tools are made specifically just to trim off those dog ears so that assembly becomes easier. And trim again. And really you're just here doing this for a while until all of your half square triangles are trimmed. Not only am I going to trim these 4, but I'm going to turn these guys into half square triangles, and then I'm going to take the remainder of my fabric and do the whole process over again until I end up with all the half square triangles required by my pattern. So there we go. So 3.5, but there's a little bit of overhang there. on purpose so that I've got some room to trim. Stabilize my ruler. I'm going to trim in 2 directions, and then I'm going to rotate, place my ruler down again, and now the 3.5 inch line is right on the raw edge there, exposing what's left to be trimmed. Whoopsie, keep it down. Trim again. Whoop. Get that dog ear. Bye, buddy. All right, and you can come back and check your work. Am I 3.5? There we go. Got the diagonal line running right along that seam, and there's my raw edge for 3.5 inch square. I admit all that trimming can be tedious, but it's about to pay off in this next step, where we're going to assemble the units that we'll be composing our pinwheel from. All right, so pay attention to how these colors are laying out. Do you notice this school busy color? That's our pinwheel shape. Now, pinwheel blocks can be made, if you want to, all out of the same fabrics, right? Like the same 2, like this. Or they can be made out of 2 fabrics, like this. Or, like we're doing, they can be made out of 3. You can even do 4. But the way this angle in our half square triangle rotates around is what makes our pinwheel shape. We have 3.5 inch units here. We're going to combine them into a larger unit that's 6.5 inches square. We're going to start by sewing across and across. So right sides together, and then we'll come back and we'll stitch our rows matching our seams. As I prepare to sew these 2 together, I want to pay attention to how these seams line up and make sure they are right up against each other, butting up against one another, the same way that we would nest seams when we're joining blocks. By doing that, we have a better chance of getting a really nice, pretty triangular point in our finished unit. Because that way they intersect exactly at the bottom. So same thing here. I'm going to do my next pair, and I'm going to pull it back and really try to get a nice nested effect. Because I pressed all of my seam allowances toward the non-yellow fabric, I'm able to really butt those seams up against one another to get good results. So then at the iron, obviously I'm going to trim all my stray threads, as always. I'm gonna be like really conscientious about that because it's just such a mess later if you don't. So then I lay my block out the way the finished unit's going to look. Try and get this where you can see it. There we go. All right, so we've got some nice points there. I'm going to press this seam allowance this way and this seam allowance this way, which is to say the seam allowances are going to go toward this gray fabric on both, so that when I put my rows together, I can nest those seams as well. So toward the gray. You see I'm not yanking on it? Sometimes you'll watch me and I'll kind of tug on my fabric. In this case, because it's all really, I was going to say delicate. It's just sort of easily manipulated. It's malleable. So there's that nice point from butting those seams up against one another. And then same thing here. Press my seam allowances toward the gray. And again, from the front. It's another thing you see me do all the time is press from the front as well as from the rear. All right, so then again, really nice point there. And because these seams are going in opposite directions, I can again nest my seams, and then this is where the needle will intersect, is right here at the tip of that gray. So if I go right sides together and I nest those seam allowances, and then when I stitch right through this point, I get a really, really nice result. Here we go. So now we're sewing the top row to the bottom with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And as I get close to this point here, that's where I'm aiming my needle. Right at that intersection. Oh, see that? Oh, I hit it. Feels good. And then I finish the remainder of my block, or my unit rather. And there we go. Goes right through, so that when we open it out, get really pretty points on our triangles. Back at the iron, we trim our stray threads, and we press that seam allowance again. It is a little bulky here. Some people will actually press this seam allowance open. I tend to burn the tips of my fingers when I try to do that, although I confess that I really do like the look. See, there's some bulk there. When I don't press that seam allowance open, I give it a lot of steam. So I'm hitting my steam here from the right side of the fabric to just get a beautiful crisp finish before I go back to my original pinwheel pieces. Look at that. And make 3 more exactly like this. So then that's our final step. I've made 4 identical units, right? So I started with each of my 4 colors, and I made my half square triangles, and I combined those into a unit. I made 3 more that are exactly the same. I trimmed them down so they're 6.5 inches by 6.5 inches, and now I've laid them out. This is the final layout in your pattern, so that we're making, not only do we make a pinwheel here, but we're making a secondary pinwheel here, yeah? Which also makes this almost square shape with the grays repeated going across, and then you get the green accent. But you could just as easily combine everything with your units in the same position, like this, very simply. And that makes this bow tie shape here. You see that when these are sewn together, this will look like an hourglass or a bow tie. This would make the same shape if we organize them like this. Bow tie, bow tie, bow tie, bow tie, there, right? And then if you were to put blocks together, of course, it would repeat and make this tricolor bow tie design all the way around. For our particular quilt, we have focused on this pinwheel shape, but you are free to combine these any way you choose, and we sew it together exactly the same way that we did each of the unit. First across, so that our seams can nest, we're going to press our seam allowances in the opposite direction, and then we're going to sew row to row. There's our finished block. We're going to trim it up with our 12.5 inch ruler, make sure it's nice and pressed, and then set it aside to save for the next episode of How to Quilt.